What if everything you thought you knew about last night's shooting was only half the story? Late Monday night, outside a luxury casino in Florida.
Gun violence. Here in the casino in Hard Rock.
Hip-hop star Offset was suddenly caught in a moment that turned from normal to terrifying in seconds. 1 minute, he was smiling, taking photos with fans. The next, gunshots, panic, and a rush to the hospital. But here's where things take a darker turn. Because almost instantly, the internet didn't just focus on the shooting, it went straight to one name. Cardi B. Old clips resurfaced. Allegations, threats, leaked audio, and whispers about a disturbing video that has people asking, was this just coincidence or part of something much bigger? Behind the headlines is a story filled with broken trust, public fights, private accusations, and a relationship that went from power couple to full-blown chaos. And now, with Offset recovering and no clear suspect confirmed, every past moment between them is being re-examined under a microscope. So what really happened that night? And why is Cardi B being pulled into a situation she hasn't even spoken on? Because once you see the full timeline, things start to feel very different. It all started like any other night. Bright lights, loud music, people moving in and out of one of Florida's most high-profile casino venues. The energy was high, the mood was relaxed, and no one, absolutely no one, expected what was about to happen next. Earlier that evening, Offset had been spotted inside the building, casually walking through the crowd. Witnesses say he looked completely at ease, smiling, greeting fans, even stopping to take pictures. In one moment, he's posing with a peace sign. In another, he's just another celebrity enjoying his night. There were no visible signs of tension, no reports of an argument, no indication that anything was about to go wrong. And then, everything changed. Outside, near the valet area, gunshots rang out. Panic spread instantly. People started running. Others froze, trying to understand what they had just heard. Within moments, security rushed in and law enforcement was alerted. The entire scene shifted from a normal night out to a full emergency situation. Offset had been shot. According to early reports, the injuries were not life-threatening, but serious enough to require immediate medical attention. He was quickly transported to a nearby hospital, where he was stabilized and placed under close monitoring. Police confirmed that an incident had occurred and that individuals were detained at the scene. But here's the part that made everything more confusing. There was no clear suspect identified publicly, no confirmed motive, no explanation of how or why it happened. Just questions. And when there are questions, the internet fills in the blanks. Within minutes of the story breaking, social media exploded. Clips, photos, and speculation spread faster than the actual facts. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who did this and why? But instead of focusing only on the shooting itself, the conversation took a sharp turn. People started bringing up the past. Not just any past. The complicated, messy, and very public history between Offset and Cardi B. Because for fans who have followed their relationship over the years, this situation felt familiar in a different way. Not because of the shooting itself, but because of everything surrounding it. To understand why her name suddenly became part of the conversation, you have to go back. Back to when everything between them looked perfect on the surface. When they first came together, it wasn't just a relationship, it was a moment. Two major figures in music, both at the peak of their rise, building something that felt bigger than just love. Cardi B had just taken over the charts, while Offset was dominating with his group and solo presence. Their chemistry was undeniable. Their appearances together made headlines. Their music collaborations added fuel to an already massive fan base. But behind the scenes, things are never as stable as they looked. There were rumors early on, then accusations, then public moments that made it clear this wasn't a typical celebrity romance. It was intense, unpredictable, and constantly under pressure. Still, they stayed together. They got married, built a family, shared milestones. And every time things seemed like they might fall apart, they found a way to come back together. Until they didn't. The cracks started to show more clearly over time. What used to be private disagreements slowly turned into public disputes. Social media became a battleground. Posts, live streams, indirect messages. Fans were watching everything unfold in real time. And when the first major separation happened, it shocked people, but not completely. Because by then, the pattern was already there. Reconciliation followed, then more tension, then another breaking point. By the time the second major split happened, things felt different. Less emotional, more final. Statements were released describing the separation as peaceful, mutual, and long overdue. But if you looked at what was happening outside those official words, the reality felt far more complicated. Because almost immediately the tone changed. What started as a quiet separation quickly turned into something much louder. Arguments spilled onto social media. Words were exchanged publicly. And the kind of things being said weren't just emotional, they were personal. Very personal. At one point, exchanges between them became so intense that fans began to take sides. Some defended Cardi B. Others stood with Offset. But most people could agree on one thing. This was no longer just a breakup. It was a conflict. And then came the allegations. Claims of harassment. Accusations of manipulation. Statements that suggested things happening behind the scenes were far more serious than anyone initially realized. According to what was publicly said, there were moments where boundaries may have been crossed. Situations involving communication with people outside the relationship. And claims that private matters have been exposed in ways that felt intentional. None of it was fully confirmed. Some of it was denied. But once those kinds of statements are out there, they don't just disappear. They stay. They get shared, reposted, analyzed, and eventually they become part of the story. So when news broke that Offset had been shot, it didn't take long for people to connect it, fairly or not, to everything that had happened before. Not because there was proof, but because the history was already so intense, so public, and so unresolved. Add to that the resurfacing of older clips, moments where voices were raised, where accusations were made, where emotions were clearly running high, and suddenly, the situation felt bigger than just a random incident. It felt layered, complicated, and for some people watching from the outside, even suspicious. But here's where it becomes important to separate what's known from what's assumed. As of now, there has been no confirmed link between the shooting and any past personal issues. Law enforcement has not publicly connected the incident to any ongoing disputes or relationships. No official statement has suggested that this was anything other than an isolated event under investigation. And yet, the narrative online continues to grow. Because once a story reaches this level of visibility, it's no longer controlled by facts alone. It's shaped by perception, memory, and the way people piece together information, whether it fits or not. And that's exactly what's happening here. A real incident, a complicated history, and a public trying to connect the dots. But what if the dots don't actually connect? Or what if they do, just not in the way people think? Because as more details started to emerge, not just about the shooting, but about the events leading up to it, the situation became even more difficult to ignore. And the deeper you go into that timeline, the more questions start to appear. As the night of the shooting faded into headlines and speculation, something else began to rise to the surface. Not new information, but old tension. Because the more people talked about what happened to Offset, the more they started revisiting what had been happening before that night. And what they found wasn't just drama. It was a timeline filled with moments that, taken together, painted a much heavier picture. It wasn't just about a breakup anymore. It was about everything that came after. Months before the shooting, things between Offset and Cardi B had already reached a point where communication seemed completely broken. What used to be private disagreements had turned into public statements, and what used to be emotional reactions had started sounding like serious accusations. At one point, Cardi went live and spoke openly about feeling targeted. Not just emotionally, but personally. She described situations where she believed her privacy had been violated. Situations where information that should have stayed between two people somehow reached others. And not in a random way, but in a way that felt intentional. That's where things began to shift. Because when private matters become public weapons, it changes how everything is perceived. According to what she shared, there were instances where messages, voice notes, and even deeply personal content were allegedly being used to interfere with her life after the separation. She suggested that her interactions, her movements, even her relationships were being monitored or disrupted. Now, whether every detail of that is accurate or not, that's something only those involved would truly know. But what matters is how it shaped the narrative. Because once those claims were out, they didn't just stay in one moment. They followed everything that came after. And then came another layer. Around early 2026, a separate situation involving Selena Powell added fuel to an already intense situation. Known for being involved in multiple celebrity controversies, her name alone was enough to draw attention. But this time, it wasn't just about rumors. It was about what she chose to release. A video clip began circulating online. In it, a voice believed to be Offset could be heard speaking in a way that many interpreted as threatening. The context wasn't fully clear, and the authenticity was questioned by some. But that didn't stop it from spreading fast. Because in the digital world, once something like that appears, it doesn't wait for verification. It moves based on reaction. And the reaction was immediate. People began linking the tone of that clip to everything Cardi had previously claimed. The idea that there had been tension wasn't new, but now it felt like there might be evidence supporting just how serious that tension had become. Again, nothing officially confirmed, but perception doesn't always wait for confirmation. At the same time, more personal content started appearing online. Short clips, screenshots, and posts that hinted at interactions happening behind closed doors. Some of it was dismissed. Some of it was debated. But all of it contributed to one thing, a growing sense that the situation between these two wasn't just messy, it was escalating. And then there was the legal side. While all of this was unfolding publicly, a separate battle was happening quietly through official channels. Divorce proceedings, custody discussion, financial disagreements. These weren't just emotional issues anymore. They were structured, documented conflicts with long-term consequences. Reports suggested disagreements over custody arrangements, financial responsibilities, and even support claims. Each side had its own position. Each side had its own version of events. And as time went on, those positions didn't seem to get closer. They moved further apart. That matters. Because when personal conflict and legal pressure exist at the same time, it creates a kind of environment where tension doesn't just exist. It builds. Slowly, constantly, until something shifts. And while none of this directly explains what happened the night of the shooting, it does explain why people reacted the way they did. Because by the time that incident happened, the story was already loaded. So when news broke that Offset had been injured, it didn't land in a neutral space. It landed in the middle of an already active narrative. One filled with accusations. One filled with unresolved issues. One filled with public attention. And that's why almost immediately, people started asking questions that went beyond the incident itself. Questions like, was this random? Was it targeted? Or was it somehow connected to everything that had been happening before? Now, to be clear, there is still no verified information linking the shooting to any of these past events. No official statement has confirmed any connection. And law enforcement has not indicated that personal relationships are part of the investigation. But the timeline, it's what keeps people talking. Because when you line things up, public accusations, leaked content, legal disputes, and then a sudden act of violence, it creates a sequence that feels like it should mean something, even if it doesn't. And in situations like this, feeling can sometimes override fact. Meanwhile, as all of this unfolded, something else stood out. Silence. Cardi B had not made any public statement about the shooting. No reaction. No comment. Nothing that directly addressed what happened. For some, that silence meant nothing. For others, it meant everything. Because in a situation this public, people expect a response, especially when the history between two individuals is this well known. But silence can mean many things. It can mean distance. It can mean caution. or it can simply mean choosing not to engage in something that's already out of control. Still, the lack of a statement only added to the speculation, because without a clear voice to ground the narrative, the story continued to grow on its own. And as it grew, it pulled in everything connected to it. Past interviews, old live streams, moments that at the time may not have seemed significant, but now, viewed through a different lens, started to feel more important. That's how these situations evolve. Not through one single event, but through accumulation. One moment connects to another. One claim leads to another question. And before long, what started as a single incident becomes part of a much larger story. But here's the reality that often gets lost in all of this. Not everything that looks connected actually is. And not every timeline tells the full truth. Because while the public tries to piece things together, there are still key details missing. Details that haven't been released. Details that may change how everything is understood. And until those details come out, if they ever do, everything else remains exactly what it is, a mix of fact, interpretation, and assumption. But even with that uncertainty, one thing is clear. This situation didn't start with the shooting, and it definitely didn't end there. Because as more attention continues to build, and as more pieces of the past continue to resurface, the story is still moving, still evolving, and possibly still far from over. By the time the investigation into the shooting started to settle into its early stages, the story had already taken on a life of its own. What began as an isolated violent incident involving Offset had now transformed into something far more complicated in the public eye. Not because authorities had confirmed anything new, but because the internet had already filled in the silence. And when official answers are slow, speculation moves fast. Police confirmed that Offset had been hospitalized after the shooting near the Valet area outside a Florida casino. They also confirmed that individuals had been detained for questioning. But beyond that, details were limited. No confirmed motive, no named suspect, no official connection to any personal disputes. Just an ongoing investigation. And that gap, that space between what is known and what is unknown, is where the story began to grow uncontrollably. Because while law enforcement worked on facts, the public worked on patterns. And in those patterns, people kept returning to one central theme: the turbulent and highly public history between Offset and Cardi B. Not because there was proof of involvement, but because their relationship had become one of the most documented and emotionally charged celebrity dynamics in recent years. A marriage that started with excitement and public celebration had slowly evolved into a long cycle of breakups, reconciliations, accusations, and silence. And by the time 2026 arrived, that cycle had already reached its breaking point. Or so it seemed, because even after separation, the connection between them never fully disappeared. They shared children, shared history, shared public attention. And in situations like that, separation doesn't always mean separation in the emotional or narrative sense. It just changes the form. And that's part of why this situation became so explosive online. When Offset was shot, people didn't just see an isolated event. They saw it through the lens of everything that had come before it. Old claims resurfaced. Past livestream clips were reshared. Previous accusations were quoted and reanalyzed. And every piece of content, no matter how old or unverified, became part of a rapidly expanding puzzle. At the center of that puzzle was a recurring question. Was this connected to anything personal? And while speculation grew, so did the reminder from authorities and credible sources. There is no confirmed evidence linking the shooting to any relationship, allegation, or past dispute. That part is important, because despite how loudly the narrative spreads online, the verified facts remain limited. But the internet rarely waits for verification before forming conclusions. And in this case, one of the most discussed elements was the idea of disturbing videos and alleged threats that had circulated months before the shooting. Some of these claims originated from online personalities, including controversial figures like Selena Powell, whose posts and recordings added fuel to an already volatile discussion. Clips attributed to private conversations began circulating widely. though their authenticity and context were heavily debated. In one instance, audio circulating online was interpreted by some viewers as threatening language directed toward individuals connected to Cardi B. In another, alleged private content was shared publicly, raising questions about privacy, consent, and motive. But again, none of this was officially verified as directly connected to the shooting. And that distinction matters. Because when you strip away interpretation, what remains is this: a shooting incident under investigation, a high-profile artist recovering from injury, and a web of unrelated but emotionally charged allegations circulating online. Still, the perception of connection persisted, partly because of timing, partly because of history, and partly because of how modern digital storytelling works, where separate events are often merged into a single narrative simply because they feel related. Meanwhile, both Cardi B and Offset continued their lives in parallel but very different directions. Cardi B had been focusing on business ventures, public appearances, and rebuilding her personal life after years of public turbulence. Reports suggested she had entered a new chapter, distancing herself from past conflict and focusing more on stability and family. Offset, on the other hand, had been working on music projects and reflecting publicly on mistakes from his past. In interviews and appearances, he acknowledged personal shortcomings, speaking about growth and accountability. But those statements now sit in contrast to the louder, more chaotic narratives that circulated online during the divorce and aftermath. Two versions of a story, one internal and reflective, one external and chaotic. And the public has been left somewhere in between. As for the shooting itself, investigators continue to piece together what happened in those critical moments outside the casino. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence are all part of the process. But as of now, the official picture remains incomplete. And that's why speculation continues to thrive. Because when facts are limited, narratives expand to fill the gap. But expansion doesn't always mean accuracy. And in cases like this, the risk is that separate threads, legal disputes, past relationships, online allegations, get woven together into something that feels like a single explanation, even when no such connection exists. That's the danger of viral storytelling. It simplifies complexity into a single storyline, even when reality is far more fragmented. Right now, there's still no confirmed motive behind the shooting of Offset, no verified link to any personal conflict, no official statement tying the incident to the past allegations involving Cardi B or anyone else in a circle. And yet, the conversation continues. Because this isn't just about what happened that night. It's about everything people think led up to it. And that's where perception becomes more powerful than proof. But as investigators continue their work, one thing remains clear. The truth of what happened outside that Florida casino is still being written. Not by the internet, not by speculation, but by evidence. And until that evidence fully comes forward, everything else remains what it has been since the beginning. A developing story surrounded by noise, history, and unanswered questions. And that's where this story stands right now, somewhere between confirmed facts and unanswered questions. We know Offset is recovering after a shocking shooting incident outside a Florida casino. We know investigators are still working, and we know there is currently no verified connection to any personal disputes or allegations circulating online. But we also know something else. This situation didn't happen in isolation. The history between Offset and Cardi B has been one of the most public and heavily discussed relationships in modern hip-hop. And whether people view it as love, chaos, or something in between, it has kept the world watching every development closely. Now the question is no longer just what happened that night. It's what comes next. If you want the full breakdown of every update in this case, including police developments, news statements, and how this situation continues to evolve, make sure you stay connected. Because in stories like this, the next update can change everything. And when it does, you'll hear here first. Like, share, and subscribe for more real-time breakdowns of the biggest stories in entertainment and hip-hop.